Let's continue to develop this center concept and let's see, for example, columns. Here we are in another temple in India. Indian poorness strikes us in this kind of travels, and it is the thing that most remains in memory. India not only is a land to visit, but to feel. It is a land that entered deep in the heart. Looking the column, I observed how this has always been the representation of the union between two big hemispheres, heaven and earth. Remember, for example, that Doric and Corinth columns already showed in its stable square basement and in its floral capital wheel, just to call to mind the tree symbol. The tree that in some way is the symbol of the man of life, which takes nourishment from earth, that is the rudest aspects of existence, then to feed itself and raise to the tiniest and most spiritual aspects. Man, as the tree, stands in the middle of these two forces. This is the triad theme: sky, man, and earth, used by several cultures. In this context, we find it resumed in the column motif, which represents the axis of these two forces. Inside the living space, a column can be valued as a totem column, which unifies these two realities. In architecture, often we find out planning in which columns, essential at a static level, are disturbing the good fluidity of the space. In regard of this, we could make disappear the column inside furnished systems, so to make it invisible, or before we can also think to value it, giving it all its symbolic meaning. Chinese people often are used to mirror or to cover the columns to make them disappear, for the reason that sometimes they generate a qi, as to say, a not so positive thing energy. It is important to feel that the column has a static pressure aspect, which we could compare with an energetic pressure. This is an important concept that we will develop later. In another travel I've made at the slopes of Tibet, in Ladakh, in a Gompa, as to say a monastery in Lamayuru, I observed the ritual that monks were doing, as to say were drawing with colored dusts, a mandala. What fascinated me is the fact that after the opening ritual, monks began to draw, starting from the center of the drawing and developing the rest of the mandala in the four directions. This ritual takes several days. At the end of it, the mandala is admired and then erased, blowing on it, to leave the immanent life sense that is a passage. This ritual touched deeply the monks whom draw on to take trouble in their inner path. For this, also in the symbolic representations, the center concept is felt. The same principle is found out in the Indian culture too. In fact, the ancient Indian knowledge, called Vastu, has a lot of links with the Chinese Feng Shui, probably just for the fact that both these knowledges are inside the same oriental area that has created several influences of cultures. In this mandala, we find out the representation of the powers oriented in the space and in the various cardinal directions. For the moment, I will not spell things out, but what I just want to show you is that, in the center, there is a vacuum, and this vacuum represents the Brahmasi, which is the Hinduist divinity par excellence, which is represented in the center of this energetic structure. Please notice this kind of being. Pressed on the ground, it is called Vastupurusha. In the Indian mythology, it represents the breaking up cosmic energy, which is stopped by through divinity power that push it on the ground in several directions, as to create order from chaos and the manifestation of infinite forms. This power of the manifestation of a place, the genius loci, or spirit of the place, expresses itself through different energetic polarities. It is very interesting to observe that in the center of the mandala stands Brahma, which is represented with an empty part. This means that in the center of a structure you do not have to build, because the center has to be fluid and has to allow the interconnection with all the other ambients. This is an Indian house that I photographed. We can notice this overture to the center in an octagonal shape. We do not go so far away if we observe the ancient Chinese houses, because these had an overture in the middle too, as Roman houses that had an overture in the middle for the water collection, called the impluvium, and so on in many traditional cultures of the world. This makes us perceive that man often is linked with other beings on earth for the reasons that human race belongs to a kind of unity. So some perceptions or feelings are in same ways passed on to an unconscious level in every living being. A sentence which I often say is, if you have a good idea, be sure that someone else is having the same idea at the same moment. This for the reason that we are all linked between us. So we can deduce that evolution factor is a synchronic factor inside all the field of transformation that human being lives. The center is, for this, an element of the space that is felt in more levels, and if we start discovering the reason of this reality, we observe that it is connected more with the inner nature than the exterior nature. This picture represents another travel I have done in Europe. It is the Frogner Park in Oslo, Norway. Here we find a set of structures that represent man life. It is interesting to observe, once again, how in the center we find this ensemble of tangle of bodies, this human totem. Buddha representation that I filmed in the Berlin Museum. You would ask, what is the link between this picture and the previous speech? This want to be a cue to think about how human being is done. We do not have just one cerebral center. Let's start to think about this representation with more depth. At the first symbolic level, the large belly represents the root concept, presence and center position that Buddha reached during his inner path. Belly represents also fertility and prosperity, and this concept is represented by other old small rounded forms too. A second level of analysis could be the way to represent the diaphragm capacity obtained by Buddha, the representation of his death breath. In my yoga experiences and other kinds of training, I understood how a deep abdominal breathing brings a deep diaphragm relaxed too. More the breathing is large and depth, more we obtain a dilatation and the organs pushing ability, just to allow us the maximum oxygenation. In martial arts, this is very used to allow a load of chi, as to say the thing energy, and then to manifest it in different modalities as defense, attack, or cure. In the navel zone, precisely an inch below, we find the expression zone of power and vitality of the human body. This point is called Tan Tien in several martial arts, in Chinese and Japanese language. This part of the body is considered the nerve center of man energy, the center of his stability and his power. A good development of this center determines good health and the presence ability of man. It is interesting to see how last medical researches discovered that inside the intestine there are cells which seems to neuronal cells, so in some way it seems that would be a second brain at the belly level. In old Chinese knowledge, brain was the outlet of a river, which started from its roots through the vertebral column, called holy bone because from there begins and is represented life. In reality, our emotions are represented in every cell of our body. Body, mind, and spirit are all interconnected with matter in every level of our body. Our body is something that is linked not only by an existence level. However, living beings have got a center which often is also the most relevant power center. It is interesting to see also how in Occidental fashion center is considered in a different way. For example, in traditional fashion, the man who has a tight pelvis and large shoulders is considered charming. In reality, long ago, was the reverse. A man who has a big presence and stability was considered charming, insofar he gave safeness and allowed prosperity. This center of mass inversion in our culture and fashion shows us how we are not seeing man in his original character. We could say the same thing for feminine fashion. Models are represented every time thinner and less prosperous. This fact underlines a lack of vision of what is natural and nice. We have always to consider that body mass acquire and deposit itself in relation with love, as so in relation with the attentions that a human being received. A woman with a blooming breast or large hips represents powerfully acquisition of maternal and paternal love. This let us understand how our body evolves and molds itself also in relation with how much attention and love we received. So, a thin body demonstrates the lack, and for that, as a consequence, a feeling of lacking power. I underline this concept just to let you understand how all this vision of fashion and aesthetic is deeply misrepresented. In contrast, we should take again these old principles that make us discover again a natural vision of the body. Also Leonardo da Vinci, Italian, with a draw called Canone delle Iscrizioni, through the representation of the Vitruvian man, in my opinion, expresses the will to define how man stands in the middle between heaven and earth. If we observe it better, we can see a man inscribed inside two big hemispheres, represented by circle and square. Man is so represented inside the way of heaven and earth, inside the five-pointed star. The interesting thing to observe is the ray of this center that ends on the navel. The center of this man, once again, is represented through the central zone of the body, union of the two polar forces. In common language, we say that we feel with the belly and not with the head. All our emotions are felt in the organs, in the heart, in the liver. The classic expression, eat your heart out, that underscore an expression of rage, let us perceive that we are something more than an intellectual aspect. We have inside us the center concept. To conclude this first part, let's underline that man has had the necessity to manifest externally what he feels internally. So recreate a center is as giving himself a center, and find out the center means giving himself a center. Since the beginning, man was looking for this center, and this inner theme had brought him to define the human talent as two. But center keeps also a power aspect. Besides that symbolic or psychological, we think, for example, to a table d'oili. If I put it in the center or by one side, I will notice the difference, because I will have an unbalanced feeling. We can say the same for a painting. If it is not well balanced in its color and weaves, we will feel something that does not work in respect of its center. Overall, in Japanese culture, this concept is very felt to recreate the feeling of the center, creating stability, creating roots, generate the feeling of refined ourselves, because center is inside us too. This is the starting point, which we are going to develop in the Feng Shui studies, because it will be very important for research of the center of mass, which we will see in the next chapters.